Get that all done, and we're recording. So, like I said, it's easy because we'll get in here, and if you need any, I don't think you will, but if you need any extra time, we'll just I'll send you over to the lab in a few more minutes to finish it. Not a big deal. Anybody? Okay, so we'll holler if there's any concerns or anything like that. I will be not, so the next I will be here then for the exam. I may not necessarily be in. I'm thinking Thursday morning like I usually am, but I'll be in for the exam. Uh, Another question. Okay, I'm not off topic. Did Dr. Hillick tell you when the MCAT test was? Sometime next week. Okay, because I have to look for my component and get that done. Okay, all right. No, it's they have a thing called in the military. They have a thing called change of command. So it's more about. I didn't go to the one a year ago in October. It was in Bahrain to start with, which is about a kind of a trip. And also, it's more about they celebrate the outgoing commanding officer, not the incoming. So that it was less. It was more about his predecessor than him. This one's about him. And I thought they were going to do it right in the middle of April because that would have been timed it about right. But they're doing it May 23rd, so we're done. So back. I have to go back to Jacksonville one last time. Darn. Boy, how upsetting. All right, we're off. All right, everybody. We begin endocrine. The other side note as I organize myself here is very simple. I had a problem with the recording. I will probably have to re-record something on what we did in the lab for those that were there or not there, and I'll just skim through it. It's pretty much uh, you know uh, routine, just sort of the background of the action potentials and the plateau and the electrocardiogram because it was about 40 minutes or so because of my distraction, which thankfully has now been resolved. You just upload one from last year, so you don't have to record it. I'll look and see if I have one. But I might not have used the same clever jokes. And I would hate you to miss that. My clever repartee. Okay, it's about me, isn't it? All right, here we go. What did we watch that was weird last night? My stepson was over. We're celebrating his birthday almost 2 months after. Go, it's just schedules are crazy. There was a Ryan. Oh, I gotta find what that is because it was cute. Maybe you guys saw it. Ryan Gosling movie. Yeah, that's right. Hey, I'm not. I'll check it out. Oh yeah, yeah. I'll tell you in a second because I just remember the name. If I Lars and the Real Girl. You remember that where he like he yeah it's a very that's a very cleverly done movie. If you get a chance, it was on Tubi, so you got a bunch of commercials or Pluto, and it's free, which is fine. But that happens. It's a really cleverly done, and he does really well for that. It's very interesting. So, moving on. All right, endocrine. So the frame is this: nervous system, quick adjustments, endocrine, slower, not slow, sometimes slow, but slow could be seconds, minutes, hours, days, whatever. Okay, so there's a variety of changes. Your endocrine is a very interesting system, and there's a lot that stems from it, particularly so in physiology, because that's your other big control center. So we have to marry the two, and the sooner you do nervous, you're good to do endocrine. Down the road, we get to the disease portion of the program, and that's where diabetes comes in. So we probably dedicate a whole class to diabetes. It's one of the few topics I actually know something about. And so, but here's the background story for endocrine. So again, things that take a while to get started, take a while to go away. Nervous system, rapid changes. We looked at that a little bit. Again, when the nerve, it was like when we looked at We looked at neurotransmitters, ones that open and charged particles moved, rapid changes. One that went through those G protein receptors, slower change. These are important little nuggets to remember. So metabolic activities via hormones. By definition, hormones is some kind of a chemical. Doesn't indicate it's water soluble or not. There's two categories, as you'll see. Slower and long lasting, but it moves by the blood and it targets, it's released directly into the bloodstream. That's what an endocrine means. It doesn't go through a passageway or a tube like a sweat gland or a mammillary gland that goes through a specific tubule or passageway. Those are called exocrine glands. They exit. Endocrine means they kind of stay inside. You want to think of it that way. It's an easy way to remember it. And what's neat about that is they go directly into the bloodstream. So they're very, very rapid. Things that go in the bloodstream respond very rapidly, not as quick as nerves. So it circulates around relatively fast, and it goes to specific target organs. It doesn't mean that it only goes to one place. Human growth hormone, for instance, goes to all the target organs. Just about every cell is impacted. Insulin would be a similar example of that. So, and then this just kind of gives you a laundry list about it. So hormones released into the blood, locations anywhere rather than being quite specific, longer rather than neurotransmitters limited by the synapse or its target space, let's say the adrenal medulla, that ganglion. It's like that. Everything. As long as these function properly, all you could make a case probably for any physiological system is impacted. So all of these are part of it. So it's really not, there's really not a lot of specificity. The endocrine is more global in that sense biologically. And so here you can see exiting, ducts or passageway exiting to a surface. It doesn't mean the surface has to be quote unquote on the exterior, but typically it is. And endocrine glands, ductless glands. Okay. So we have some examples, not limited to, but part of this. This is why we don't do it in anatomy. It's a very much a physiological, non-anatomical system. You have a limited number of relatively small glandular structures. So the ones you hear about the most: pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pineal, which you really don't hear about a lot. Okay, the hypothalamus. When I framed our discussion about the brain, okay, and the structure of the brain, that's the quote neuroendocrine link, because it shares both neurological and endocrine functions, and indeed it is where the blood-brain barrier is weakest, and therefore that's where your body senses chemical changes. Other kinds of changes as well, but chemical changes in the sense of sugar levels, salt levels, hormonal levels, reproductive function. All of those are part of hypothalamic functions. We explore that. We have a lot of dual players. The pancreas is both endocrine and exocrine. Famously, we'll get to its exocrine functions because that's where digestive enzymes, many are produced, quote unquote digestive juices. They go through a pancreatic duct into the gut and impact significantly your ability to digest. But the exocrine function, exterior. Okay, it spits it out into the bloodstream, and it's insulin and a companion substance called glucagon, which we'll get to. The gonads, eggs and sperm, those travel by ducts. Okay, but estrogen, progesterone, testosterone are by definition endocrine players. Placenta, a lot of material goes through a series of ducts or passageways to feed or nourish in some way, shape, or form in many different aspects the growing embryo and then fetus. Actually, be fetus because basically that defines the transition. And yet it secretes substances like HCG, for instance, human chorionic gonadotropin, into the bloodstream, which played an important role in maintaining pregnancy. And lots of other ones that will sort of get commented on in the meantime. So there's the anatomy, and there isn't much. Pineal gland, you might remember from the brain dissection, it's a tiny area, really almost at the back, called the epithalamus, sort of neatly spaced in between the lobes, sitting kind of right on top, right at the base of the cerebral lobes, on top of the thalamic or diencephalon area. We didn't even see because it's so small. We only could see a tiny little triangular area of hypothalamus. If you did one which had the dura on, the pituitary gland was encased in blood vessels. It was a kind of a firm bump on the undersurface of the brain, very small. You can feel your own thyroid glands. They're the easiest ones to feel. Just go on either side of your Adam's apple. Those are the fleshy thyroid glands. And the parathyroids, even though it's a totally different gland, it secretes totally different stuff, okay, are immediately on the posterior aspect of it. And you can't discern them palpably. You can see them, let's say, arbitrarily, surgically in that regard. And then you have the thymus gland, which effectively shrinks as we reach adulthood around age 17. So here you can see the adrenal glands, very tiny amounts on top of each kidney. The pancreas, fairly large, you know, testes and ovaries. And there's other structures that have endocrine function, as we would say. So when we talk about hormones, the implication is traveling through the bloodstream and maybe not always, but frequently some distance. Whereas opposed to autocrines, literally means it produces a hormone that travels outside of the cell and comes back in and then impacts the cell. And the most famous one of these, when we get to gastrointestinal in detail, is gastrin. It's produced by the enteroendocrine cells, you might remember, in the stomach. And what it does when it triggers, it's the primary agent that creates stomach activity and enhances the production of all the different other substances, the pepsin and the acidity and all of that type of stuff, the proton pump generation. So that's an autocrine. So it exerts effect on the same cell that it's made. Stretch receptors get it triggered. Paracrines, interesting. Local mediators. A lot of aspects, as we'll get to, immune system, come from a substance that originally was named for where it was originally isolated, prostate, called prostaglandins, which we may have talked about before. They are made from essential fatty acids like arachidonic acid, which you found gloriously in peanut butter. Oh, I'm a peanut butter addict. Peanut butter anonymous. I'm Lou. I've been an addict for 70 years. It's easy to quit. I do it all the time. And I can't go back and keep eating it. And so what it is, I'm sure you must have gotten this in the biochem or the cell molecular. It's got a couple of sites of unsaturation. It kind of turns around and changes its morphology, its shape chemically. This modest chain fatty acid. And it forms looks like a little key-like structure with active ends. So it kind of goes from linear, and then it kind of does this, and a little bond forms here. Hey, look it up. We're not doing chemistry or biochem class, but that's what they do. And those are basically affect cells in the area. They're pivotal in inflammation, absolutely pivotal. They're pivotal in allergies, which is really an offshoot of inflammation. So if you're taking, like I did, a Zyrtec in the morning, you're inhibiting certain types of prostaglandins from doing their thing. So the locality of them excludes them from this discussion, which brings us in. There are two categories, and basically they divide not only amino-based or peptide-based hormones, amino acid and peptide-based, versus steroidal, but more importantly, non-polar covalent, read that as fat-soluble, and polar covalent, read that as water-soluble. And yes, we have the ever-popular oddball. And the oddball you will see is thyroid hormone. This thyroid hormone is made from our old friend tyrosine, good old dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, should know that for the test. Okay, and you basically take two tyrosines and one straight right side up. Remember, sort of kind of like DNA, right side up, upside down. And you add a couple of iodines, 3 or 4, and you have a very symmetrical molecule. And symmetry is what makes nonpolar covalent. So even though it's amino acid based hormone, thyroid hormone, the active form T3 or T4, its actions are those of cholesterol or steroidal based hormones. So anything from cholesterol, and that's all we use with the exception of thyroid hormone, gonadal or adrenocortical hormones. The eicosanoids is, again, that's really the category of those prostaglandins. Technically, they're there. So we look at them more when we look at aspects of inflammation and aspects of other activities that are there. Target cells, because they have a receptor. And the receptor, as you know, if it's fat soluble, can pass through the membrane, the receptor will be in the cytoplasm. But the large percentage of these are those good old, can't know enough about them, G protein receptors, which you keep seeing that silly diagram they've used 5,000 times. And you'll see it again. But I like it. I mean, it just tells you what it does. Okay, so what does it do? Anything. Membrane permeability, insulin allows more glucose in. Channels for ions. It's either going to make them more likely to polarize, less likely to polarize. Stimulate other enzymes, activate or deactivate, induce secretion, stimulate mitosis. Pick it. So they have anything that you could imagine that it could do inside of the cell. It does. It just does it differently. And the best comparison, and we do this a lot in this chapter, is human growth hormone versus insulin. Human growth hormone is now, even though it's not a steroid hormone, it works like steroid hormones. It stimulates mitosis, it stimulates repair, it builds muscle, and it does so at the expense of fat. Fat is its energy source. So it's the perfect performance enhancing drug. Build muscle with the advantage of using fat and creating lean muscle mass. Nothing could be better for an athlete than that. The flip side is insulin. Insulin is designed to do the same thing and promote mitosis, but not at the expense of fat, at the expense of carbohydrates. Carbohydrate metabolism, which is theoretically, if you want to think of it that way, a cleaner kind of energy, because we don't have those harmful fatty byproducts. The reality is that carbs are a big trigger in a lot of people for inflammation. So as we learn more about the dietary aspects, I'm hardly an expert in nutrition, yes, sir.
Why can't you take a weight loss pill? What does it like work?
I don't understand.
Why can't you take a weight loss
Why
pill?
can't you?
Yeah.
Oh, you can. Okay, it's more the side effects of it that inhibit the usefulness. When I started on one of my many diets, I went on an amphetamine analog, basically an ephedrine analog. Very effective because it does curb your appetite and it does stimulate your metabolism. The side effects long term, rage, anger, things like that, aspects of your personality are a problem. Plus, they impact your sleep cycle. The new ones, the Ozempic and things like that, a little different. I don't understand how they work, but there's problems attended to. Everybody's been looking forever for the best diet, and probably it's because there is outside. So people want something to eat. Dieting is hard for a lot of people because they like to eat. You know, my existential relationship with food. I eat, therefore I am. But it's okay. I don't have an answer for that. But you can, theoretically, but you have to be aware of and be able to deal with the side effects and understand when you may have to take a break from that stuff. And then it's really dieting to me. It can be medication assisted, but it's all about getting into the habits of it. And it's just so easy to break. My wife and I were great the first time we went on keto. Just great. And then it just got a little bit more inconvenient. Wasn't a lot of other activity, but it coincided with the lockdown. And the next thing we started to do, all of a sudden, hey, it's fun. Go out and get good stuff. We go to the break. Let's bake a cake. Like there's a great recipe if you like vegan cakes. There's a lot of vegan cakes because they don't necessarily involve. This is a chocolate cake recipe, totally vegan, and you can make vegan ice cream. Icing rather. We made it yesterday. It's great. Of course, it's got a cup of sugar in it. Hey, not for somebody skinny, you're not giving that up for Lent, are you? Yeah. No. No, that's a personal decision. Right. Sorry. But you weren't down there in New Orleans for Mardi Gras last night, were you? Yeah, it would have been a heck of a trip. We went to one. We went to the first Mardi Gras parade, which is usually start in January. The St. Joan of Arc crew. I have pictures. So we were sitting on it was very interesting. There you go. So water soluble, all those peptides, excluding, of course, thyroid, plasma membrane receptors, G proteins, donor cell, waiver, all this. Lipid soluble, steroid and thyroid, intracellular receptors, receptor in cytoplasm, into the nucleus, transcription, translation. Got it all. So again, just definitionally, we know the primary messenger is the hormone. The secondary messengers typically are in these, and you've had chapter adversities in cell molecule, right? You know, the calcium-based one. What's that? PIP is. What's the acronym stand for? It's my time. Oh, what? Oh no. PIP is something. This is why you have telephones in your hands, isn't it? Uh, 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 Signaling molecules, PIP2, phosphatidyl at the 4, 5 positions of inositol. So phosphates with inositol. There's an acronym for it. So it's phosphoinositide signaling pathway. Because you do the inositols, I know, in cell, right? So it's above my pay grade. I'm not that smart. So we all know this G protein, adenylate cyclase, just basically interacting with the ATP, eventually getting it down to cyclic AMP, happy dance. And it activates typically a chain reaction inside. And of course, kinases activate because they give a phosphate. It's a high energy phosphate that they utilize, so it packs energy, but more important, it increases solubility. Phosphates make it's like glucose entering a cell. It goes from glucose to G6P. We energize it and we make it more water soluble simultaneously. And it's no longer glucose, obviously. That always creates a gradient for glucose to come in. It's a good system. And phosphorylate means you take one away. So phosphodiesterase is rapidly degraded by enzyme phosphodiesterase, stopping the cascade. So, but they amplify once they trigger that sort of chain reaction. We're not going to go through all that same thing again. That's there. Okay. So here it is, the inositol triphosphate, calcium released from intracellular storage spaces, diaglycerols activate protein kinases. I'm not going to ask you that. But that's, if you see the names down the road, at least you have an idea where they would fit in a question. Okay? So again, they're cell molecular based questions, less for us. So calcium ions are the other second messenger, and we go back to that smooth muscle protein, again, that you're going to see on the exam on Friday, called calmodulin. Remember, changing the shape of calmodulin activates those myosin kinases. That's what kind of makes that sort of twisty and widening thing of the smooth muscle. And yes, anything that's in that adenine guanine category, because of what they are, they're purines. So they have very, very similar aspects. So it could be cyclic AMP or cyclic GMP. And the one that's probably the best understood is tyrosine kinase enzyme. And then it phosphorulates a lot of things to activate those systems. So docking sites, relay proteins. And that's what I mean. Insulin, years ago, insulin, it just increases blood sugar. And that means, increases blood sugars entering the cell, and therefore you're going to make more ATP. But now we understand more about the specifics of the mechanism, molecularly, which I would presume to teach you. Lipid soluble, you all know about. Steroid and thyroid hormones into target cells, relatively easy. Receptors inside, enter the nucleus, transcription, translation. We know all about that. And again, I've seen that or a similar illustration a lot of times. I don't think it's relevant, so I'm going to skip it. With some rare exceptions, the negative feedback predominates. Yes, you heard about blood clotting and female reproductive with oxytocin. Those are the most notable. You'll see when we explore repro, as the MedCat students already did a little bit, we see more evidence of that in certain reproductive physiological aspects, where we see a little bit more positive feedback. So right now, for your purposes, the default is negative feedback. Okay? How does that work? What kind of inhibition is that? Competitive? It's a big word because it changes its shape. Sometimes it's in skin products. Allosteric or non-competitive inhibition. Like aloe, hydrocortisone with aloe. So, how are things released? Basically, we could look at different kinds of control. Nervous system is an override. Hormones certainly control it. You're going to see a number of these things. So there's three. Humoral implies blood levels. Remember, humor was an old term for body fluids. So it implies blood levels in the bloodstream, hypothalamus, not enough sugar, we'll get more in, et cetera, et cetera. Neural stimuli, mostly sympathetic v parasympathetic. Hormonal stimuli, one hormone impacting the other. Estrogen and progesterone levels being relative to, as they start to lower, then you're going to see they stimulate the release to it, what we call an arc. And that arc is very important. About basically that will release something from the from the hypothalamus, which will impact the posterior pituitary, which will impact the anterior pituitary, and begin to reverse the dynamic. It will increase lower estrogen and progesterone levels. Those are typicals. So the ones we see most famously, calcium and glucose. When we started the course back in that was negative feedback 101, and stuff you already heard before. Changing blood levels of ions and nutrients impact it directly. So this is a chapter where we're going to revisit calcium. And calcium is all about parathyroid hormone. And if there's one thing that's just true, you've already seen it with nerves, you've seen it with muscles, calcium levels are extraordinarily important physiologically. So the declining blood calcium concentrations stimulate almost specifically parathyroid to secrete parathyroid hormone, which goes by several different means, which we'll go over, in bone, in the gut, and in the kidney, to retain calcium in the blood. And by doing that, it immediately exerts negative. As soon as it starts to retain the calcium, we signal with less. We signal less parathyroid hormone. We signal less to that area to secrete it. They're showing you the location that's there. Again, they're typically 4, sometimes as many as 8 small nodules on the back of the thyroid gland, the posterior aspect, facing away from the Adam's apple. Sympathetic nerves, catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, classic pathway. Okay, so, and again, you have to always view that as an override. So, boom, emergency setting, boom. Hear a noise, hear an ambulance pull over the side. You're having an immediate response that's an override to what you're doing, because you just have to do it that way. And that would be the best way, I think, to describe that. which is showing you the area, the medulla. So, and now hormones impacting hormones. And we see a pretty consistent loop activity here. So it's almost like we look at blood levels of whatever. We call this an arc. Sensed in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, anatomically, as you remember, has an actual physical portion of it that goes down and becomes sort of the base for the pituitary gland. So it's the name you might remember, infundibulum. So it's a little piece of neurological tissue. Yeah, you can just put it right over there on top of the, thank you. Hypothalamus to the infundibulum, and then the infundibulum basically attaches to a portion of that hypothalamus. It makes up posterior pituitary, and because it is brain tissue, it is called neuro. Fancy name for pituitary is hypophysis, Hysis, and then that will signal where really the major hormones come out of the anterior pituitary, which is really, so this is really nervous. This is true glandular. And as you might, this is called the adeno hypophysis. So that's basically it. So if the blood levels go down, we'll increase them. When they start to increase, we'll feed back and shut down that pathway. And you'll see this repetitive all the time. So they're not all that way necessarily. For instance, calcium would probably be pretty much of a direct line into the anterior pituitary for, specifically for releasing more parathyroid hormone. But most of them are like that. So as you can see, one stimulates the other wherever it's going, and we'll get to it. So it can modify to a certain extent. And again, I look at it as an override, stress, hypothalamic and sympathetic nervous systems override insulin to allow blood. So basically what happens, you're flipping the switch. Again, insulin is more about the rest and digest. It highlights parasympathetic activity. So now, hey, we need that sugar for an emergency. So stop. And so you're going to see there's a lot about that. When insulin is active, we actually counter growth hormone. Okay. But we stop insulin when we have to utilize an extensive amount of sympathetic activity. We use sugar for another purpose. To me, it's very logical in that regard. So specific receptors. So this is ACTH. You're going to have to know these 6 major pituitary hormones plus 2 or 3 of the major hormones, maybe a few more from the posterior pituitary. Stands for adrenocortical, the exterior, not the medulla, of the adrenal gland, tropic, which means growth or production hormone. So it's called ACTH. Found only on the adrenal cortex, whereas thyroid hormone, which certainly increases metabolic rate, but does so all over the body. So again, some are very specific, some are very generously laid out. Okay. Target cell activation, principally, I would think the most important is blood level, and the other two maybe less so. It's interesting how our body will adjust and will either uptick or downtick receptors. The affinity is fairly consistent. So I think the big level is levels more than anything else. It's not the only factor. To me, it would be the most important factor. So if you have target cells form more receptors if the hormone levels are low, they almost make themselves more sensitive. And if hormone levels are consistently high, they become somewhat desensitized. And that's, to me, that's almost like a defense mechanism. With people who may have borderline endocrine disorders, either too much or not enough, it basically tries to, and the body's very good like that. it consistently tries to make subtle modifications to avoid significant damage. It's like anything else. When we get to the immune system, is a perfect example. We can cope with occasional cancer cells developing, okay, because our immune system will identify them and destroy it. But when it's overwhelmed by an abundance of cancer cells, or if it's overwhelmed because there's a fault in the immune system, the cancer takes over, and then you're in big trouble. How it works. And again, same nugget. If they're fat soluble, they're going to need a protein carrier. So steroids and thyroid hormone have to find a plasma protein that's compatible. Usually, it's aspects of it have to do with albumin. All the other ones basically are soluble enough in the bloodstream. And so we look at the rate of release and the speed at which there is inactivated. There's a lot of nuances. So how do we inactivate these substances? Rather straightforwardly, we, not unlike neurotransmitters, we degrade them, acetylcholine, we break it apart. So that's one way. More commonly, they're either excreted by the kidney partially or totally, or the liver detoxifies them or breaks them down, and then the kidney takes over. Frequently, that's the liver's way of doing things. It metabolizes them in such a way to make them more water soluble so the kidney can excrete them. That's why we look for products in the urine to give us an idea of toxins or an abundance or an absence, relatively speaking, of substances. And we used to do a lot of that, and they still do, collecting 24-hour urines, because that's the way you can identify it. You need a lot of urine there for it to be able to process it to get a reading for a substance relatively small. So it's a lot of depends, and half-life. You've heard the term half-life. In the case here of hormonal half-life, for the level of the hormone to decrease by half, it doesn't mean its activity reduces. A lot of substances biologically have what we call active metabolites. They still impact you. Neurotransmitters, we talked about the cannabinoids. Cannabinoid products, even though we break them down into something else, still have certain degrees of activity that are more prolonged. They have what we call active metabolites. That's something in medicine we take into account with certain kinds of agents. It tells us how frequently we have to administer them pharmacologically, what precautions we have to exert. We look at things like that. If someone has problematic kidney function, you better give them less of a high sodium substance because they can't get rid of the sodium. There's all these little nuances, particularly for you are medically oriented. So again, the steroidal ones typically take longer. Good news. Bad news, they stick around. Fat-soluble things store in fat. That's the big problem unfortunately, with drug testing for individuals. Certain substances stay around for a long time. My day and age, we learned a lot about that.
The drugs that
Marijuana stays a long time, for instance. So, when they used to test that, what they started to do, because people became aware of some of these things, they take products to neutralize their urine, which were semi-effective, and then they started doing hair samples.
Why does it stay so much longer in hair?
It takes a while to accumulate in the hair. It's just your hair down to the follicular level stays there. It takes a long time comparatively for it to grow out. So they just. It's lie detector tests were common. My buddy did one of those. He didn't smoke any pot for 6 months, so he felt comfortable he could take the lie detector test.
Did he fail?
He passed.
Those are baloney anyway.
They are baloney, but a lot of workplaces were using them at the time. It was because there weren't as many restrictions as you would think. It was a lot more. It's different, and I say this in all earnest to any of you who are going to be in fields that are licensed, and if you have any chance of coming in contact with controlled substances, don't. mess up. The term I would have used, of the F word. Okay, because that follows you around. Oh, for a long time. Yeah, the things DUIs follow you around. I told you that anecdote about my kid when they had a random drug test when he was still at CMU. He was like flipping out. I mean, it's understand the ramifications of it. That can impact you. I've chapter and verse to the nursing students because they're rolling around with a cart filled with narcotics. They won't be able to do that if they can find a job. You know, it's you all are now, and if you haven't known it by now, most of you certainly do. This stuff follows you around. Under 18 can follow you around. Just saying. Half-Life, yeah, all are different things. A lot of I don't do a whole lot of this, and thankfully, don't have a lot of time yet till we get to specifics. You know, it, reproductive hormones, and we're going to see that a lot with thyroid hormone. Adequate thyroid hormone makes other systems work effectively. Okay, so that's permissive. It just allows it to work. Versus synergism, there's an amplification. So at fight or flight, we see the release of both glucagon and epinephrine, which augment each other in the active process of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So they make more sugar available for the emergency. And insulin and glucagon are the classic pull and tug. We'll talk about it in diabetes. They come from almost the same area, slightly different cell in the exterior portion of the pancreas. And one releases sugar and one basically causes sugar to be absorbed. So one puts it in the bloodstream and the other one effectively takes it out. But because they're working together, it avoids peaks and troughs. Peaks and troughs are very suggestive of diabetes. I say it all the time. Living systems don't make sharp turns. So, round. More on that. And here's the hypothalamic nugget. The stalk is the infundibulum. The 8 major ones are the ones you certainly have to know. The 2 major neurohormones, which are effectively neurotransmitters, but they're secreted rather than a synapse directly into the bloodstream. That's oxytocin and vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone. They're relatively simple. They're 8 or 9 short polypeptide chains. We make them genetically, pitocin, for stimulating the birth process at the time of delivery, and what's called DDAVP, which indicates it's genetically manufactured, whatever that acronym DDA, I know it has for adenosine is the other thing, and VP is for vasopressin, so DDAVP is what it uses. It has a lot of usages, not the least of which, you might have heard me mentioning it in passing to Mason when we talked a little bit about blood, is that my first wife had to take that because one of its effects isn't just to retain fluid. Okay, it also has other effects, and in this case, it actually stimulated the clotting mechanism because she had a variant of a disease we're going to look at in blood called von Willebrand's disease. And then there's 6 from the adeno hypothesis. You'll see that I'll pop to those now and come back without going through the anatomy of it. And I'll go back to the other stuff because we don't have a lot of time left. And I wanted to cover those. Terminals from the hypothalamic, and there's different nuclei, paraventricular and supraoptic. Damage there is very significant. People have a hard time surviving. With that, tumors there. Maybe I mentioned Dudley Moore in passing. Wonderful comedian, did a lot of great stuff. Early days, died of a tumor from that. Very, very young, 40s. Oxytocin and ADH, again, 9 amino acids. And we'll get back to what they do and the positive feedback and osmoreceptors and blah. And we'll get back to that. And then these are the ones that you must know. The 6 tropic hormones, and they're all effectively tropic. I don't buy that. Growth hormone certainly is tropic. Okay, it doesn't just regulate other things, but it's about growth. So HGH or GH, thyroid stimulating because it stimulates the thyroid, adrenocorticotropic, stimulates the adrenal cortex, follicle stimulating hormone because it stimulates the follicles for eggs and sperm, luteinizing hormone because it stimulates the ovaries and the testes for estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And prolactin is still somewhat mysterious despite its obvious role in lactation. So down the road, you have to start getting busy remembering those. So I will stop here at as we begin to look more at this and pick up with a more in-depth look at the hypothalamus. And next time we'll get to the pituitary hormones, probably thyroid and parathyroid, and say middle of next week for diabetes. Thank you.
The test only goes to 11, right?
3, 9, 11. I know that's odd. Hey, thank you too.